The wolves did not move. 43 of them held the courtyard from wall to wall, flank to flank, their breath rising in the frozen air as one slow cloud, and not one of them stepped aside when the Alpha King reached the enclosure gate. Kador of the Northern Keep had 11 years of absolute command at his back and a sealed removal order in his fist, and his pack looked through him as if he were smoke, as if the gate were a threshold they had voted on, and he had not been consulted. At the center of that gray and black mass, so small she might have been a trick of the torchlight, a young woman knelt in the snow with both hands wrapped around the muzzle of the largest wolf anyone in the keep had ever seen. She was not trembling. She was not looking at the king. She was murmuring something into Sable's ear so softly that the nearest guard could not catch a single word, and Sable's amber eyes were closed, and the whole courtyard had the character of a held note. What no one told you about that morning, if they told you anything at all, is what Kador did next. The history claims he acted from duty. The history is the version Steward Oren would have preferred, and Oren by that point had stopped being in a position to prefer things. What Kador actually did was stand at the gate for 7 full breaths, count them without knowing he was counting, and feel something shift in the architecture of his own chest, as if a weight he had carried for 11 years without knowing its name had, in the span of one breath, grown heavier and more deliberate and more insistently his. He came to remove her. His wolves had other intentions. In the 413th year of the Northern Pact, in the last grip of winter before the frost-claiming night, an Alpha King came to his own enclosure to enforce his own order, and the world he had spent 11 years building held its breath to see whether he could. Lena had come to the wolf enclosure the way most unwanted things come to the places that will keep them. Quietly, in the dark, with nothing to recommend her except the fact of her presence and the steadiness of her hands. She had been 16 when the debt dispute ended, when the land her father had farmed for 40 years was assessed and weighed and handed to a creditor she had never met, and when Mira, the old wolf keeper who smelled of pine tar and dried herbs and long winters, had found her sitting on the keep's boundary stone in the first snow of the season, with no pack, no name, and nowhere particular to go. Mira had not asked questions. She handed Lena a pair of leather gloves and said the wolves needed their water troughs broken and refilled before the cold set in, that the ice came thick on the inner well by the second hour past midnight and someone needed to be up for it, and that there was a cot in the back of the feed store if she wanted something to be between her and the ground. Lena took the gloves. She broke the ice. She slept on the cot. That was the beginning of 6 years that she spent learning the specific grammar of creatures who trusted scent before speech and instinct before ceremony. The wolves did not organize themselves by human measures of worth. They did not care that the registry listed her as Omega, unaffiliated, no secondary designation, no pack name, no claimed status. They cared about who came in the dark without flinching, who remembered which wolf preferred to drink from the bucket's near side and which one turned away from the ladle until you offered the rim directly, who sat with the one named Vel through 3 nights of joint sickness in the coldest week of the season and sang to him something formless and low because there was nothing else to do. She was not a wolf. She had no wolf in her. The registry was right about that. The wolves did not require it. She kept a small carved wolf in her coat pocket. Her father had made it the winter before the land was taken, from a knot of birch wood that had grown into the shape of a running animal almost without prompting, almost as if the wood had decided before the knife arrived. He had pressed it into her palm the morning of the assessment and told her it was only a piece of wood and she had better not lose it, which was his particular way of saying it mattered. She had carried it for 6 years. Her hands found it in the cold, and it was warm. The removal order had arrived 3 days before Kador did. Steward Oren brought it himself, which was the first indication that something was wrong. Oren did not ordinarily trouble himself with the wolf enclosure. He was a wide man with narrow eyes and hands that were always a little too clean for a man of his stated responsibilities, and he had run the keep's accounts for 9 years with a thoroughness that two different external assessors had praised in formal letters that still hung in the records hall. He stood in the enclosure gate with the order in his hand and his cloak held tight against the cold, and read the charges aloud in the even voice of a man who has rehearsed them. One unclaimed, unaffiliated Omega, currently serving in a caretaking capacity without official sanction, was to vacate the wolf enclosure and the keep grounds before the next census review. Disruption of pack order. Authority. The Alpha King. Hi. Mira sat very still on the feed bench while Orin read, and then she sat still some more after he had finished, and then she said, "On what specific grounds?" Orin folded the order and tucked it away. "The grounds are printed," he said. "They do not require elaboration." He looked at Lena the way he always looked at her, which was to say he arranged his face to look at where she was, rather than actually looking at her. "She is no one's wolf and no one's concern," he said. "The order will be carried out." Two men had come the following morning. The wolves had blocked the gate without sound, without threat, without a single display of teeth, which was in some ways more unnerving than if they had snarled. The men stood outside the gate for 20 minutes and then went away. A third man came that evening, a senior guard with the keep's sigil on his coat, and the resignation of someone who had already guessed how this would end. He did not even reach the gate. Sable met him in the outer yard at a distance of 40 feet and sat down, and the guard looked at Sable and looked at the 42 wolves spread across the courtyard behind him, and made a decision that he later reported as a reasonable tactical assessment of available resources. He did not mention the ledgers. He mentioned the supernatural influence. Orin had sent word to the Alpha King that the Omega in the enclosure was defying removal and that the pack appeared to be under some kind of unnatural influence. He did not include, in that account, that he had for 3 seasons past been diverting 17 silver weights from the pack's quarterly care and feed tithe into a secondary account that bore his seal and no one else's, or that the woman he wanted removed had found the discrepancy 2 weeks ago while cross-referencing the feed ledgers against the supply manifests, because she had noticed the outer wolves were thinner than they should have been at the end of autumn, and she wanted to understand why. The outer wolves had been thinner because their feed allocation had been shorted. The feed allocation had been shorted because Orin had been taking the difference. Lena had the numbers written out in her own hand in a margin of the 3rd season manifest, and she had been planning to bring them to someone, except that someone had filed a removal order before she could choose whom. And so the Alpha King had come himself. Sable lifted his great head when Cater reached the enclosure gate, and what passed between them was not defiance in any ordinary sense. Sable had known Cater since the wolf was a pup, no bigger than a feed sack, had slept at the foot of his bed through 3 winters of illness and 8 years of unbroken command, had never in his life refused the king a single thing. He refused him now with a specific gravity, the way a very large and very certain creature refuses, which is not with aggression, but with the simple, immovable fact of itself. He turned his head back toward the woman kneeling in the snow, lay his chin in her gloved hands, and closed his amber eyes. Cator studied the woman who was not looking at him. Dark hair tucked under a linen wrap, a coat that was practical in the way of things worn until they are the shape of the person inside them. Gloves repaired so many times there was more patch than original. She was murmuring still, lips close to Sable's ear, and her hands were absolutely steady, and every wolf in the courtyard was watching her the way wolves watch something they have decided about. He stepped through the gate and the pack shifted around him, fluid and close, allowing him passage without yielding its arrangement, and the cold pressed in from all sides with the weight of 43 animals' attention. Lena looked up when his shadow reached her. She did not stand. Her hands were full of Sable's weight and she did not drop them, and the look she turned on him was level, steady, and entirely without the performance that people aimed at alphas to keep themselves safe. Not defiance, not calculation. Something more unguarded than either, and therefore, in its own way, more unsettling. "You are the keeper," Kador said. "I tend them," she said. "Not the same." He held up the removal order. She looked at it for a moment, the way she might look at a weather report that confirmed what she had already known, and then she looked back at him. "Sable's companion," she said. "Vel. He's been drinking from the outer trough. He's been sick 3 weeks. I need 2 more days." She did not ask permission. She stated a fact and waited to see what he did with it. Vel was not difficult to find. He was the gray wolf at Lena's left, his breathing shallow, his ribcage working harder than it should. Kador crouched without quite deciding to, and the pack allowed it, parting just enough, and he put his hand on the wolf's flank and felt the unnatural chill of frost silver poisoning coming off the animal's skin like smoke off ice. Frost silver was the refined compound used to treat the ceremonial threshold bars before the frost claiming. It suppressed a wolf's ability to sense the bond, to shift, to respond to command. He knew its signature, the cold that went beneath the coat and lived in the muscle. He had not expected to find it in his pack's water supply. He looked at the outer trough, 20 feet away with its iron lip and its murky skin of ice. Then he looked at the inner well that Lena worked from, the one with the clean stones and the wooden cover she had built from spare planking, the one the inner yard wolves drank from exclusively. He understood in the way of a man who has just aligned 3 facts that had been waiting for each other, precisely what the arrangement meant and why it had taken Oren 3 additional removal attempts after the initial order to achieve nothing. The wolves drinking from Lena's well were unaffected. The wolves drinking from the outer trough were sick. The frost silver in the outer trough had been placed there to suppress the outer wolves' instincts, to stop them from acting on whatever the inner yard wolves had been acting on all along. Oren had thought to silence the pack. He had managed only to poison part of it. "How long?" Kador said. 3 weeks since the sickness," Lena said. "The outer wolves started losing weight before that. I pulled the feed records at the 2nd week. There's a 17-weight discrepancy going back 3/4. I was going to bring it forward." Kador stood. He held the removal order and looked at the seal on it, which was his own, applied to Oren's account of events without the context that would have changed everything. The peculiar sensation he had filed under anger moved, as he stood there in the cold with 40 wolves watching him, into something more specific and less comfortable. "Who else has seen the ledgers?" he said. "Mira. No one else." He looked at the gate, where Edric stood with his hand on the latch and his face arranged with the precision of someone who has already understood what is happening and is allowing the king to arrive at it in his own time. Kador held out the removal order. Edric took it. "File it," Kador said, and walked back through the gate before Lena could say anything, because he did not trust himself to stand there in the cold, with her steady attention on him, and manage a sentence that would serve any purpose he could defend. He came back at dusk. She did not hear him coming. She was at the inner well, breaking the thin skin of ice on the surface with the back of her fist and letting the fragments drift to the edge so the wolves could drink from the open center. Sable was pressed against her left side the way he pressed against no one. Not the stable boys who had fed him 5 years, not the kennel masters who had trained him, not Edric who had raised him from his 2nd winter. The courtyard torches had been lit, and the yellow light came at them sideways across the snow, and she was humming, not quite a tune, something formless and low that the dark absorbed without effort. He stopped at the enclosure wall and watched her without announcing himself. She was refilling a smaller bucket from the well and carrying it to Vel specifically, tilting it so the wolf could drink from the rim without bending his neck down, which hurt him. Her hands were bare. She had removed the gloves to feel the temperature of the water, checking it was not too cold for a wolf already managing a low fever, and the torchlight showed the slight redness across the backs of her knuckles, the kind that frost silver contact leaves behind when you have been treating an affected animal without adequate protection. Not fresh. The redness was 3 weeks old and still fading. She had been doing this since before Oren filed his order, since before anyone was watching, which meant she had been doing it for the wolf's sake and no other reason. He reached through the broken section of inner fence, the one she used as a passage through the wire, and before he had consciously decided to, his hand was close enough to hers on the bucket's rim that she startled, and the water sloshed cold over both their wrists. His fingers stopped an inch from hers in the air between them, and he became aware with a specificity that had no precedent in 11 years of command that she was very warm standing next to him in the frost, a warmth that had nothing to do with coats or fires. "I should have brought gloves," she said. "You should have brought gloves," he agreed and stepped back. He did not leave. He stood at the wall while she finished the watering and covered the well and stood up and brushed the snow from her knees, and neither of them spoke, and Sable lay between them with his head tilted as if listening to a conversation that had not yet found its opening. The stars were very clear over the keep's north wall. He had not looked at the stars in some time. "You do not flinch," he said. She looked at him, waiting for the rest of it. "When I come through the gate, every person in this keep flinches when I come through a gate. Servants, guards, the elders, most of them." He stopped. He had not intended to say it aloud. "You are the only person who does not look at me as if I might break them." She looked at him over her shoulder with the kind of directness that people train out of themselves in the presence of power. "Would you like me to?" "No," he said. She turned back to the well cover and adjusted the latch, and he stood at the wall and watched the line of her shoulders in the torchlight, and the weight in his chest that he had carried unnamed for 11 years had settled into a new and more specific position. The way a piece of bone settles into an injury you did not know you were managing until someone pressed on the right place. Edric was waiting at the keep door. "The ledger discrepancy is confirmed," Edric said, which Cador had known since the moment the frost silver cold came off Vel's flank, and the arithmetic resolved itself. 17 weights, 3/4. The secondary account leads directly to the steward's seal. The correspondence in the outer office names the vendor he has been paying. He paused. "Oren knows you've asked for the records. He has been in his study since midday." Cador looked back at the enclosure. He could see the light of Lena's lantern moving between the dark shapes of the wolves as she made her last round of the night, checking each one. "Station a guard at the enclosure," he said. "At the gate," Edric said. "Or inside?" "Inside," Cador said. "Edric. Inside." Edric did not say what he was thinking. He was a good beta for this reason, among others. "Understood," he said, and Cador went inside, and the night tightened around the keep, and Oren sat in his study with his falsified second ledger on the desk before him, and his face very still. The council chamber the following morning held 6 elders, Steward Oren at the secondary table, and one guest who had arrived after nightfall and who had not been expected, Counselor Aldrich of the Southern Covenant, a thin man with a scholar's stoop and the particular careful attention of someone whose profession is the permanent record. He had been en route to the Northern Keep for a quarterly review of pact obligations. Oren's invitation, sent 3 days prior at the moment when he believed the removal would be quick and the Omega gone and the ledgers safely buried under a new set of false figures, had arrived at an opportune moment. Oren had wanted a witness then. He wanted an authority whose seal on a record of the Omega's lawful removal would close the matter irrevocably. He had not anticipated Cador's delay. He had not anticipated the ledger request. He adapted with the speed of a man who has survived 9 years of keep politics, and he stood before the assembled elders and laid out his account in a measured, sorrowful register that sounded like the reluctant disclosure of someone who had hoped not to be necessary. The Omega in the wolf enclosure, Oren said, had been falsifying feed records to disguise her theft of pack resources. The 17-weight discrepancy was not his accounting. It was hers, designed to implicate him and prevent discovery. He had a second set of books, prepared during his investigation of her activities, which demonstrated the real movement of funds. He had brought it in a leather case he set on the council table with the unhurried care of a man who has nothing to hide, and opened it, and left it there for the elders to examine. Lena stood before the council and looked at the ledger Oren had produced, and said nothing for a moment. The hand that had written the entries was not hers. The date stamps covered weeks, for which she had her own records, kept in her own margins, in her own entirely different script. She looked at Oren. He looked past her with the expression of a man who has already written the verdict and is waiting for the room to catch up. An unclaimed Omega, he said to Councillor Aldrich, with the careful sorrow of his measured register, who has bewitched the pack and introduced foreign substances into the water supply, who has cooked the feed ledgers and used the pack's protection to evade accountability. He set his hands flat on the council table. The evidence is plain, Lena said. I would like the outer trough water tested. Oren's expression did not change by a measurable degree. The outer trough, he said, is a trough. Water does not require testing. He looked at Councillor Aldrich with the expression of a man extending professional courtesy. The foreign envoy need not witness the disposal of a stray, he said. This is a housekeeping matter. It need not take the Covenant's time. Aldrich wrote something in his record without looking up. The council voted. The removal order was reissued as an arrest and expulsion, to be carried out before dawn. Lena would vacate the enclosure grounds and the keep entirely. The beta assigned to escort her would see her across the boundary before the frost-claiming ceremony began. She was brought back to the enclosure to collect what she owned, which was her spare coat, a pair of boots with the right sole repaired twice, the feed records she had kept in her own hand for 4 winters, and the carved birchwood wolf she pressed into her coat pocket without looking at it. A guard stood at the gate. She sat on the feed bench with the lantern between her feet and waited for the dark to deepen. Mira came at the first bell of evening, moving through the guard at the gate with the authority of a very old woman who has decided the guard is not her problem. She sat beside Lena on the bench and did not speak for a time, and then said, "You know what tonight is." Lena knew. The frost claiming began at the moon's zenith. The pack's oldest right, older than the keep, older than the Alpha Kingship. During those hours, no wolf could be compelled by rank or command or ritual authority. Whatever choice a wolf made under the frost claiming was recorded as sacred by the Northern Pact and could not be legally overridden by any subsequent order. 2 guards. A removal to be carried out before dawn, the frost-claiming night, arriving in the exact hours between. Mira took Lena's hands in both of hers and held them and said, "The name Ashvain was in the Covenant records for 3 generations. It was taken out of the registry when the land was taken. The registry does not decide what the wolves remember." Lena looked at the wolf enclosure, at the dark shapes moving in the snow. "If an unclaimed Omega enters the frost-claiming circle," she said. "If the pack chooses her," Mira said, "it is recorded. Under Aldrich's seal, under pact law." Lena turned the carved wolf in her pocket between her fingers and looked at the moon rising above the keep's north wall. She was not afraid. She was not particularly anything. She was simply present, the way she had been present every night for 4 winters in the wolf enclosure, and she was making a decision about what to do next. If you have stayed this long, you already know what she did. Hold one more moment. Watch her do it. Lena walked into the frost-claiming circle at the moon's zenith with nothing to recommend her except what she had always had. The wolves came to her. Not Sable first. Sable was already there, pressing his great head to her sternum as she stepped inside the circle's perimeter, turning at once to face outward, his back to her chest and his amber eyes on the shadows at the courtyard's edge. The others came from the outer enclosure and the inner yard, and the gaps in the wall where the oldest ones slept, the ones whose coats were going gray at the muzzle, and who had been tended in their slow decline by the same pair of hands that now stood open at Lena's sides in the cold air. They came, frost silver still running through some of their blood, and the frost claiming ran deeper than poison and deeper than Steward's orders, and deeper than anything Orin had thought to calculate when he arranged for the outer trough. They came because the frost claiming is older than the hierarchy, and because the body knows before the mind allows, and because the pack had known what she was from the first night she broke the ice on their water trough in the dark without flinching. 40 wolves. One ring and then a second and then a third at the outer perimeter, breath rising in the cold as one slow cloud, amber eyes catching the torchlight and holding it. The moonlight came into the courtyard, and there was no sound in the world except the sound of their breathing and the far-off bell marking the hour from the keep's tower. 6 years with no pack name, 4 winters in the wolf enclosure, 2 removal attempts that had not reached her. She stood in the center of all of it and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with the specific recognition of something that has always been true finally being said aloud, where it cannot be ignored, that she had never been nameless to them. They had simply been waiting for the hour when they could say so in a language that law was required to hear. Cater came through the main gate. He had not been summoned. No one had sent for him. He had been at the window of his study watching the frost-claiming circle fill and fill and fill until the count of wolves pressed itself into his chest with the weight of something trying to be understood. And he had put on his cloak and walked out of the keep into the cold with his crown on and no particular plan, because his wolf was at the center of that circle, and because there was a woman there who had not flinched when he came through the gate, not once, in 3 days of occasion. The wolves parted for him, not entirely, enough, and closed again behind as he moved toward the center, and the warmth coming off 40 wolves in a circle on the coldest night of winter was a physical presence, living and close. He stopped 3 feet from Lena and looked at her. She looked at him. Around them, 40 wolves watched in a silence that was full, entirely full of whatever they had known about these 2 people for longer than either of them had been willing to accept. He felt it arrive. Not as a thought, not as a decision he could describe in the language of command, as a physical event. The weight in his chest resolved into its actual shape, which was not anger and not duty and was, in fact, precisely what it had been from the moment her shadow had not moved when his reached her in the snow. He had been carrying it for 3 days while refusing it a name. He gave it one now, standing in the wolf circle in the cold, with Aldrich's pen still moving at the courtyard's edge, and the 6 elders watching from the gate, and Orin somewhere behind them, with the expression of a man watching the ground go out from under a plan he had been certain of. He had been 11 years in command, 11 years of people performing steadiness in his presence, people who were afraid of what he might do, and arranged their faces accordingly. She had not once arranged her face. She had looked at the removal order and told him what she needed for Vel, because that was what was true, and she had seen no reason to lead with anything else. She had told him she did not intend to flinch at him because she had not been asked to perform something she was not. He did not know what to do with that, which was why he had been standing at walls watching her, instead of managing the matter decisively. He said, "She is not the one being removed." The words landed in the frost-claiming circle and stayed there, absorbed by the cold and the wolf breath, and Aldrich's open pen and the 40 pairs of amber eyes in the dark. Aldrich wrote them down. Cador turned toward the assembled keep at the gate and named Oren's second ledger for the fabrication it was. He named the secondary account and the 17 weights, and the 3 seasons of siphoning and the frost silver in the outer trough's water, which Edric had tested that morning with the keep's own assay stones, and which had come back contaminated at a concentration no natural source produced. He named Lena's original ledger and the discrepancy she had found, and the removal order that had been designed to reach her before she could bring the discrepancy to anyone with the authority to act on it. And then he named the Ashvane lineage, which Aldrich wrote and sealed, and which 3 of the 6 elders recognized by the change in their faces because the Ashvane covenant was 3 generations old, and the wolves did not forget what the registry had tried to erase. Oren said, "My lord, I can explain." He did not explain, because Edric was already at his side, and the explanation had, in any case, run out of material. The chamber hearing the following morning was not long. Aldrich's record from the Frost claiming night made it unnecessary to relitigate what had been witnessed under pact law. The 17 weights were recovered from a sealed chest in Oren's quarters in the early morning, along with correspondence that extended the siphoning back further than 3 seasons, and a copy of the falsified ledger that still bore, in the ghost of its first draft beneath the final ink, the corrections that proved which version had come first. Oren was stripped of the steward's seal before the assembled elders and escorted from the keep grounds before the day's 3rd bell. He was given his horse and his personal effects and the road south, and no one in the keep watched him go with anything that resembled regret. Councillor Aldrich signed the pact record in front of all 6 elders and set his personal seal beside Cador's, and whatever standing the registry had stripped from the name Ashvane, the Frost-claiming record, and the councillor's formal notation restored in the language that the Northern Pact recognized above any registry, the language of witness choice, freely made in the sacred hour. The elders did not kneel. Elders do not kneel. Not as a rule. They inclined their heads one by one in the order of their seniority, the eldest first, the one who had been in the records hall when the Ashvane name was removed from the covenant rolls, and who had said nothing at the time, because he had been 20 years younger and considerably less certain of what he owed to his own silence. He inclined his head to Lena with the specific gravity of someone settling a debt he had been carrying longer than she had been alive. Sable lay at Lena's feet with his chin on his paws, watching the assembly with half-lidded eyes. 40 wolves behind him, still, patient, amber-eyed. The morning light came hard and white through the north wall windows. Cador knelt. He had been 11 years in command, and he knelt in the packed snow of the frost-claiming circle, still marked by the ring of wolf prints from the night before, with Aldrich's pen in the air and the 6 elders' witness and the keep assembled at the gate. And he looked up at her. He had spent 3 days watching her tend wolves she didn't own in a cold she didn't complain of, with hands she didn't protect, because she was using them for something that mattered more. And he understood. With the particular clarity of a man who has finally stopped misreading a text he has been translating incorrectly for 11 years, what his wolves had been trying to tell him. He put his fist to his chest. He held it there. Everything he was and had built was present and intact in the gesture, and he was yielding it forward, offering it as the ground she would stand on rather than the cage she would be required to inhabit. He did not have a speech. He did not, at the moment of the kneel, have words of any particular utility. He had only the gesture and the weight of the 11 years behind it, and the specific cost of doing this in front of every person in the keep rather than privately, where it would have meant something smaller. She put her hand over his fist. Her palm was warm and rough from the leather gloves and the cold mornings and the 4 winters of work, and she did not say anything either, and the wolves around them breathed in slow unison, and the morning held the moment for exactly as long as moments hold before they become the thing that comes after. The morning after the hearing, Lena found Mira in the enclosure at first light, the old woman already at the inner well with the bucket and the breaking pole, her pine tar smell and her calm as unchanged as the stone walls. Mira looked at her over the bucket's rim and said nothing for a moment in the way that people say nothing when they are full of something that does not yet require words. Then she said, "Vel is eating on his own." Lena crouched beside Vel and ran her bare palm across his flank, slowly, from shoulder to hip, and felt the frost-silver cold receding the way ice recedes from stone warmed by the sun, in patches, reluctantly, leaving the wolf's own warmth to fill the space behind it. His breathing was slow and even. His ribcage moved without the labored effort of the past 3 weeks. She stood up and rested her hand on his back for a moment. The keep was quiet around the enclosure. The third bell had not yet rung. The snow in the courtyard still held the shape of the knight's ring, 40 wolf prints in a circle, and in the center of the ring, 2 sets of human tracks, one arriving from the gate and one already there. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the carved birchwood wolf, smooth from 6 years of handling, the wood warm from being pressed against her side through the night. She turned it in her fingers. The running animal her father had found inside the knot, the shape that had been there before the knife arrived, that had simply needed someone to release it. She had carried it for 6 years and had not let herself think too carefully about why, except that her hands found it in the cold and it was warm. She heard Kador's step on the threshold behind her before the door opened. His step had a particular weight on stone, distinct from every other step in the keep, and she had learned it in 3 days the way she had learned everything about the wolves, not by study, but by the attention that living alongside something requires without asking permission. She did not turn around. She looked at the wolf in her palm and listened to the sound of the threshold taking his weight, and Mira's hand came over hers from the left, warm and certain, closing around the carved running animal and her fingers both. The keep opened itself to the morning.